For my session, I was just remarking that a session like this post-lunch is a little tricky. Pre-lunch would have been better. But in any case, I'll introduce myself. I'm Archana. I've written 2 books. I've also published both the books. So I'm an independent writer and publisher of 2 cookbooks. My first book, 5 Morsels of Love, which is a tribute to my grandmother, was published in 2016. And my new book, Why Cook, is very new. It's a couple of months old. So I was just talking to ma'am over there just before the session started, and she said she doesn't know how to cook. And actually, the beginning point of my journey, I didn't know how to cook. And now I'm the author of 2 cookbooks. Okay. So that's a picture of me and my grandmother and my brother from 1987 or thereabouts. My grandmother was an excellent cook and a cookbook author. She had written a Telugu cookbook called Vanita Vantakalu in 1974. So it's almost 50 years next year of the publication of that book. And she always had this dream of translating her book into English. And I was a student here at ISB at the Indian School of Business in 2006. And she told me, can you sponsor my book project? I said, I'm a student with a big, heavy MBA student loan. So let me get past that loan situation, and then I'll invest in your book. But as fate would have it, she passed away because of cancer in 2007. And I had not cooked till this point. All the while, my conversations with my grandmother were about how I'll help her get this book published. So in 2007, when I decided to complete that project, I didn't know how to cook, but it was some kind of a blind determination that propelled me into the kitchen. And I thought it would be an easy job because I had eaten her food all my life, and this book was there. I can read and write Telugu pretty well. So I thought it would be an easy translation job, that I'll pick this book up and I'll start translating, and it should be done in a year or so. But it turned out that going into a kitchen, not knowing the difference between tur dal and chana dal, not knowing how to make like a basic tadka, was a big point of, ignorance. And it was very humbling to, take a step back and realize maybe I'm not the right person for this project. So my grandmother also had left boxes and boxes of handwritten recipes. So it was quite a daunting project not to just look at that book that you see there, which is like this simple paperback. But there were also all these other recipes floating around. That's the only inheritance she gave us, because she didn't believe in jewelry and she didn't believe in money and things like that. So the only inheritance we had from her was this boxes and boxes of recipes. So when I started sifting through them and started teaching myself how to cook, it took me 9 years. From 2007, this book had a journey of 9 years. 2016 is when I published this book, because I really had to teach myself to cook, teach myself to write, because all these things I thought were easy things to do, but it turned out none of them were. And also because I also made the decision to self-publish. My grandmother had self-published her book in 1974, as I said, almost 50 years ago. And she sold 15,000 copies in a day and age where there was no internet, no social media, very few bookstores. In a day and age where there was no platform for her to really put her work out, she managed to do that job. So for me, that was a great source of inspiration to do this book myself. Although I did write to a few publishers, there was interest, but I had a very particular vision of what 5 Morsels should be. And the reason it's called 5 Morsels is my grandmother has 5 grandchildren. I'm the oldest. And the logo that you see on the book is 5 grains of rice. So when my book designer asked me, what's the most important ingredient for you in the kitchen, she thought I would come up with a spice. maybe, some chili or something, because also Andhra cooking is so stereotypically associated with chilies. And I said, no, I can't think of my life without rice. So that's how the 5 grains of rice became kind of the symbol of the book. And the 5 grandchildren are kind of encapsulated in the title there. So that's the team that worked on my first book. To my left is Chinmay, who you'll also encounter in my second book. Chinmay, at that point, was a photographer, so she's done the photography for my book. My editor is hiding in the back, Sonia, as always. She's always in the background, but a very important part of my life and my creative process. Sonia was a journalist, turned baker, turned part-time cookbook editor. She doesn't do it full-time. This is like a part-time thing for her. And my book designer, who you'll see to the extreme left, to my extreme left, Esther. She's Hungarian. I met her online. When my book was near completion and I had a particular vision of how this book should look, I started researching book designers from around the world whose work I really liked. And that's how I chanced upon Esther. And initially, she did not agree to do the book because she was just very busy, and also I couldn't afford her. But when she heard the story and the motivation for this book and how it was being done from a point of love and sincerity, she was totally moved by the story itself. And she's like, no, I really want to do this book. After a conversation, it completely turned her purpose, and now we are really good friends. And I found everybody not in a very, nobody came to me like, I did not advertise, I have this book project, are people willing to work with me? And as I said, I was a business school student and I was working in technology. I had a full-time job, so this book was a part-time project for a number of years before I quit in 2015. And I said, the next 1 year, I have to give this book everything. Like, every single moment of my being should be dedicated to 5 morsels, and that's how it got published. Otherwise, I would have kept working on it like for many more years. Anyway, so that's the team that made my first book possible. And when the book was launched, I got it printed at Pragati, which is not too far from here, which is maybe a 10-minute drive from here. We got the books out of the press. I was sitting in the press, reviewing every page that was coming out, clocking in late nights, whatever. And the books came out, and I drove my mom's Innova up to the press to load the books into the car. And I had no idea what I was going to do with the books, because this project was a very inward journey for me, to feel closer to my grandmother, to keep her memory alive. So it was a very close journey, and I had not started talking about the book externally or anything. And at that moment, I was so terrified. Like, I have these 2,000 books, and this was edition 1 at that point, and I had no idea who was going to buy this book. And I would get a lot of feedback from people, like how everybody wants to give advice, right? Who would buy a book in a day and age when there is internet, YouTube, recipes are free? Why do you think anybody would want to come and pick your book up? And I don't have an answer to that, even today, but my book continues to sell. So it's the end of edition 3 for my first book, so I'm going to go back to Pragati for edition 4. It's an answer that surprises me, because I think it's a story that has deeply resonated with a lot of people. The other thing people would tell me is, nobody will buy your book in Andhra. Andhra people know Andhra food. Why would they want to buy an Andhra cookbook? And it turns out, again, it's completely a flawed assumption, because Hyderabad is probably the biggest city I sell the most in. It's maybe a record. It's also recipes that have been making their way in our own table for 50 years. There are some recipes which you'll probably identify with, but as with India, I think every home has something unique about how they cook. what ingredients they use, what kind of masala. Maybe we'll use the same garlic, dried coconut, and red chilies, but how you do it versus how I do it, that subtle nuance of how we do it. And there's one recipe in this book called the eggplant biryani, and I always joke that I have over-marketed that recipe. But that's the most, it's like a 2-page recipe, the longest recipe in the book, something so counterintuitive to why it would become so popular. But I know people buy this book sometimes just for that one recipe. You know, that's the power of, I think, able to recreate something beautiful with your hands in your own kitchen. Yeah, possibly. So it was, as I said, a completely unexpected. I actually titled this slide "An Unlikely Success," and my husband walked in when I was making this slide, and I haven't done this in a long time. So he's like, "Why are you calling it an unlikely success? You should call it an unexpected success." Anyways, the story is that I didn't expect this book to change my life. I was ready to go back to a job. I thought my tribute to my grandmother was brought to a logical conclusion. The book's out in the world. I should go back to work. The other thing I have to mention is that when I started writing Five Morsels, my son was 6 months old. It was also a journey of me wanting to feed everything my grandmother fed me to my son. I think that connection was also very important to me. Because I remember my grandmother so much because of all the food she fed me, and I wanted to have that same connection with my son. So when the book came out, my son was 4 years old. I just put him on a plane with a bunch of books and went off to the US on a book tour. And the book was very well received across different cultures because I'm self-published, which means I also ship the books myself. And I've sent Five Morsels to 40 different countries. And why would anybody, want to buy a book made in India, there's this other thing somebody told me, that micro cuisines are making a comeback, like regional micro cuisines are making a comeback. So the timing of your book is very correct. And I'm like, I don't think I did this book with timing and trends and fads and with this thing that, okay, the timing of micro cuisine and my book will coincide. So those were not the motivations for me to do this book. I remember when I was writing it, my husband would continuously annoy me. What is the biggest dream you have for this book? And I'm like, I don't have any dreams. I want to finish the book. That is my biggest dream, to actually complete the book. And he would keep on pestering me, like, really, dream big. Like, what's the biggest dream you can have? And at one point, to just silence him, I said, maybe if New York Times covers it, I would have, said this book has arrived, which is such a flawed way to think about it now that I say it. But it so happened that New York Times covered the book, and I'm not sending these books out to journalists asking them to cover my book, because that's another unnecessary moral stand I have, that I will not give people books and free books and ask them to write about my work. It's unnecessary at a certain level, but anyways. So New York Times covered it, and there's this, so many prizes across the world do not encourage self-published books. So the minute you say you're self-published, they're like, don't even send your book. They cut it off because they think self-published books are garbage. So I don't even qualify for many awards because it's a criteria where I'm kind of not even allowed to cross. But it turns out there is this prize called the Art of Eating Prize, which is an international award. It's given out by an independent jury, and you cannot nominate your book. Somebody has to nominate your book. And when I mean somebody, there are a few independent bookstores in the US that can nominate the book. And somebody in the US nominated my book. And I was at a literature festival in Chennai, and I got a message saying, in the next week, you have to send 8 copies to these 8 jury members. And they were all over the world, the jury members. And the email didn't stop there. They said, because you're independently published, we'll buy your book. And it was such a moment of gratitude for me that spaces like this exist in the world, that there is this independent award, which is independently recognized by jurors around the world, and they're willing to buy my book. I'm not paying to enter this competition. Somebody's paying me for me to be able to be a part of the jury. It so happens that these books are from all over the world, and it made it to the top 6. I lost out to a different book, but anyways, so it was completely an unexpected turn of events, and one after another, one after another. And this was not me going and seeking out things. This was the book finding its way into the world. And I was just following wherever the book was taking me. So again, as I keep saying, I thought that was the end of my writing journey, the end of my cooking journey. At some point, my editor said, you should have an Instagram account, because if you don't talk about your own work, who will do it for you, and things like that. So then I created an Instagram page, which gathered some attention. And I think sometime in 2018, late 2018, my book designer and I have, in the course of this whole journey, have become really good friends. So we are, almost soul sisters. And she decided to come to India every year. So every year we pick a destination, whatever she wants to go see in India. So we've gone to Darjeeling, we've gone to Rajasthan, we've gone to Kerala. And through the course of these trips, she would ask me, what's your next book? I'm like, I don't have a next book in mind. But it was a continuous question she would ask of me. So what's your next book? What's your next book? What's your next book? And I think at sometime in 2018, towards the end of 2018, I told her, I'm ready to do a book, without knowing what the book was. I'm ready to work on a book. Also, Five Morsels by then was in edition 2, was doing well. I had very little work to do with Five Morsels other than shipping it. What happened while I was teaching myself to cook over those 9 years is I also started making friends from all walks of life who had cooking as the core of their own life journeys. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. But Why Cook is a lot of people are calling it an extension of Five Morsels in a way, because it talks about women's lives. It talks about different women from different parts of India who are artists, who are mountaineers, who are permaculturists, who are farmers, who are writers. So they've done very different things in life, but somehow the kitchen and cooking anchor them. And what's the connection between me wanting to be a musician and me wanting to cook? And why do they coexist? What do these two artistic practices draw from each other? So that was the question I was trying to explore. And all the while, I was asking the same question of myself too, because, how the society looks at you. Oh, you went to REC Warangal, you went to ISB. What are you doing writing recipes? Aren't you overqualified to do this job? So it was also a continuous stream of me trying to justify my own existence at a certain level, saying this gives me the most joy. This gives me the most purpose in life. And for me to have that awareness and not to be swayed by these societal versions of what they expect you to be was, so I kept asking myself the question, why do I cook? And also all questions of the environment, questions of ecology, all these questions were also surfacing, like how do I want to live my life with the most minimal impact on this planet? How do I reduce plastic usage? And what does all of this have to do with cooking? Where do I source my vegetables from? Where do I source my rice from? Anyway, so these were questions I was having along the journey of my own relationship with the kitchen. So then I realized I used to write emails to myself. I've not been doing that lately, but whenever somebody inspires me, I write an email to myself. Oh, this person has inspired me because of this, this, this. And over a period of time, this list of women who I was inspired by was growing. And I realized those life stories were powerful enough for me to share with the world. So I decided to go meet women who were my friends, who I was inspired by, who all had a story with the kitchen. And that was the genesis for the second book, Why Cook? So I started from Bangalore, which is where I live right now. Kurnool is where I was born and brought up. And the book went, like I traveled all over, like India with my photographer and book designer. And the last place we went to was Nagar, near Kullu Manali in the Himalayas. And this was 2019. So I'm just stressing that after this, travel became impossible. I'm just stressing the point that I traveled in 2019. It was almost the universe telling me, go, go, go. And I come back, pandemic starts, everything is shut. I stopped writing the book. For a year, I couldn't just make sense of the world, make sense of myself, make sense of the moment we were living in. Then I had a bad fall. I was bedridden for 6 months. So in the course of all this, I started writing the book again. In the midst of all this pain, somehow the book became my life savior in a way. I wanted to draw inspiration from these stories myself to sustain myself and to kind of, live through the pandemic in a way. In fact, today marks a year of me getting COVID. So it's all very, anyways, the book really helped me focus and live through those difficult few years. And now what I'll do is there's 16 stories in the book. I don't think we have time to go over everything. So I have 4 or 5 stories. We'll see how we're doing on time. Okay, I'll also keep 10 minutes for Q&A just in case you have question and answers. Yeah, okay, all right. So I'll just talk about a few stories from the book to just give you a representation of what the book holds. This is a story of my friend Molly. And those of you who are familiar with the Timbuktu Collective, is anybody familiar with the Timbuktu Collective? Okay, great. So Molly's parents started the Timbuktu Collective about 30 years ago near Anantapur. They bought, this is Molly's story, that they bought 32 acres of land at that point for 800 rupees an acre, and everybody thought they were mad people because nothing grows there. I'm from Rayalaseema, so I know how that land is. It's parched, dry, nothing really grows there. And this, her Bengali father and Malayali mother decided to make Andhra their home. And now it is a thriving agroforest habitat. They work with 21,000 farmers. They've completely, and actually if you look around the Timbuktu area, everything else is still dry. But Timbuktu is lush and green. Like if you see it, like Molly had this picture from, if you see it from a drone, there's this patch of green, and then it's dry all around. So what they have done with that land is just remarkable. Molly, of course, was born in Timbuktu. She continues to live there. And I met her actually at a sari exhibition. She also started a small weavers unit in Timbuktu. And we met at a sari exhibition where she had got these saris. And these are all first generation weavers who have no experience weaving. These are all like women from disadvantaged backgrounds. And Molly and I became really good friends in that, through the course of, many conversations after. And this is a story, and she continues to live there. She continues to document the ways of she once showed me like a packet of rice, and she's like, do you know what this is called? This is called pichibiyam. I'm like, pichibiyam is like, literal translation is mad rice. She's like, this rice can grow in any kind of climate. It's climate resilient, and we have forgotten how to grow this rice. So there's a lot of loss. There's a lot of things that are disappearing that she's trying to document and bring back. And she also had this story that she told me that, okay, this is the year of the millet. Like the world over, people are celebrating millets, and suddenly everybody is like, yeah, we eat millets, it's very cool. But she was talking about this story in 2000 when she used to get millets from Timbuktu to Bangalore. So the good thing with Timbuktu is they have access to Bangalore, so it's quite close for them to move the produce to Bangalore. And she's like, people used to come and buy millets for bird feed. And they would never think of cooking millets for themselves. She's like, this became exotic bird feed, and nobody was even considering eating millets. And she's trying to educate, saying, it's good for the environment, it's good for you. She even wrote a little like a zine with recipes, millet recipes. How do you popularize this food that we know? It's heirloom, it grows locally, it requires very little water. So she's done a bunch of work in the food space. And then she told me once that she was in Brazil and she cooked a dinner for 350 people. And I'm like, what? And she sent me the menu of what she had cooked. So it was a tribute to her Bengali grandmother. There was some Malayali recipes with her mom's Malayali. And because she lives in Andhra, there was some Andhra recipes. So she's cooked some of those recipes for Why Cook. So she shares like a Bengali dal. There's a green papaya pulisari, which is a Malayali recipe. There's a Timbuktu peanut powder. So that peanut powder is actually sold by Timbuktu, but it's in the book because Timbuktu and peanuts are so synonymous. She's like, I have to make the peanut puri. But I'm like, you also sell it. She's like, so what? I'm happy to share it with the world. So there's a Timbuktu peanut puri. And they have a caretaker who's called Simam, who has lived in Timbuktu from like years. Simam's Aritikai Vepudu is in the book. So the recipes that each of the women I featured contribute are very close to them. They represent them in some way. So that's Molly's story. That's Arundhati Nag. How many of you know Arundhati Nag? Who doesn't know Arundhati Nag? Yeah, exactly. So I wrote parts of 5 morsels in Rangashankara, which is the theatre space Arundhati Nag built, and that is how I became friends with her. Because I would go drop my son off to school, which was right next to Rangashankara, and I would sit in Rangashankara till the time it was for me to go pick up Arjun back from school again. So just by this act of sitting in that cafe there and writing the book over a period of time, we became really good friends. And then she would invite me to her farmhouse, which is not too far. It's in the city. And every time I would go, there would be like something that she would cook. And it would be something as simple as chai, but she'll quickly go into the garden, like cut like a lemongrass and put it in the chai. Or if she's making a pot of rice, there'll be a turmeric leaf plucked out of her garden and put in the rice. Oh my God, rice cooked with turmeric leaf is so fragrant. It's unbelievable. So all these little things she would do. And she would send me back with bags of bitter gourd from her garden. Dondakai, ivy gourd. So there, she makes a thing with the ivy gourd leaves. There's a recipe with ivy gourd leaves she makes. She's cooked that for the book. So I would always be fascinated every time I would meet her that this woman who's done such a big service to the world by establishing this theatre space also has this close connection to gardening, to nurturing the earth, to cooking. And her story is that her mother never let her into the kitchen till she was 14 years old. And when she was 14, her mother told her, now you have to become independent. And one of the ways of becoming independent is learn to cook for yourself. And that's how she got initiated into cooking. At 14, she learned how to make basic roti sabji and things like that. Then she got married to Shankar Nag, who was at that time a very famous actor in Karnataka. Unfortunately, he died in an accident when Arundhati Nag was 35 years old and their daughter was 5 years old. And she says in the book too, that till that point, she never cooked Saraswat food. Saraswat community is the community Shankar Nag is from. She's like, it was a way of preserving my own identity. Like, I didn't want to cook my husband's family's food and get dissolved in this process of losing my own identity. And I'm like, that's a very powerful way to look at food. But she says now, 40 years from the time she has gotten married, and I think 25 years since Shankar Nag has died, the food she cooks the most is the Saraswat food at home. And she shares Saraswat recipes in the book because she's like, it's a way for me to keep that memory of my husband alive. The way her entire life has been about, establishing this theatre space. I think so much of her life has been about preserving his memory. So she's cooked some of the recipes that remind her of Shankar Nag for the book. She's also cooked another mutton recipe which reminds her of another friend. So when you see these food and listen to these stories, there's a very strong connection between how we lead our lives and why we cook. And in fact, one of the things she told me, again, which is captured in the book is, she's been asking me too that I want to do these poetry readings every Sunday morning at Rangashankara, because she also sees food as a very integral part of Rangashankara. So we have like the mango mela. Every summer there's a mango mela where anybody can take a kilogram of mangoes and be part of this mela. So, there are like hundreds of kgs of mangoes pretty much on that day, and you can go taste other varieties of mangoes. Onam Sadhya, every year without fail, the Anju's Cafe does Onam Sadhya. So there's a lot of food also in Rangashankara for me. And the most popular food items that are sold at the cafe are akki roti, sabudana vada, which are all very local. The chai is like 20 rupees. So, and the programming in Rangashankara is Kannada largely. So people from all walks of life come to the space to view. So the food's very affordable too. So she has this vision of what food should be. And she also said, I want to cook a recipe for your book, but I won't cook. And this was a recipe she learned in the red light area in Bombay. And she said, the reason I don't want to share it in the book is I actually want to consolidate all those recipes I learned in a particular time in my life in Bombay and teach trans chefs and establish a line of canteens called Shankar Canteens. And these recipes will be cooked. And I want to train this set of chefs to make these recipes I learned in Bombay. And I'm like, wow, there's so much power to that aspiration and to that wish of, where are these recipes coming from, who is cooking them, and then put Shankar Nag's memory onto the whole project. So that's a project I hope will get done soon, but that recipe is not in the book. How much time do we have, Sangeeta? 8 minutes. So I'll probably talk about 2 more stories because, I know so much about each of them that I can keep going on. Like, I can do an hour on Arundhati Nag if required. Anyways, so Vishala runs a collective called Buffalo Back in Bangalore. Is anybody familiar with Buffalo Back here? Okay, a couple of them. Okay. Vishala's story is that she's a CA. She had a practice as a CA. And I think sometime in her mid-30s, she decided to become a farmer. And she started farming at the outskirts of Bangalore, near the Banerghatta forest. She started with like tur dal, urad dal, ragi, sesame, and she had 8 acres, and both her husband and she were trying organic farming. And she realized it was extremely difficult. Organic farming is difficult. And their farm is located in the elephant corridor. So elephant corridor basically are parts of land where elephants used to migrate from one point to another, depending on the time of the year and things like that. And when elephants come, they just trample all the crops. There's no mercy there. So she's like, every time a crop comes up for harvest, very soon it would just be trampled by these tuskers. So she's like, how do I coexist? How do I coexist with elephants? Clearly, I have taken their land away. It's not the other way around. I have taken the land away. So she's made half of her, I think her farm's grown now, and half of the farmland is a forest now, where she has left bodies of water so the elephants can actually drink water while they pass through this land. I know people who put firecrackers, electric fences to ward off these elephants. I've seen people, use different types of tactics to in the view of in the idea of scaring them away, right? But this conversation I had with her was all about coexistence. How do I coexist? How do I make this possible for the elephants and for myself? And in fact, Vishala's Buffalo Back home is very close to my own home in Bangalore. And I used to take my son Arjun every Wednesday to her house, mostly because I wanted Arjun to also pick vegetables, get a sense of, where is our food coming from, all of that. I selfishly wanted to talk to Vishala. Like, I selfishly wanted to hear everything she had to tell me. So she would give me some recipe for jackfruit seeds. She would give me a recipe which is something very obscure with some purslane leaves I found once in her. So it's a collective now. So the vegetables come from different farmers, a few hundred farmers. And she also told me a story once about, she calls it the bee principle, like the honeybee. A worker bee makes about 1/12 a spoon of honey in the 6 weeks that it's alive. That's the life of the bee. It's alive for 6 weeks. It makes 1/12 a teaspoon of honey and it dies. So for me, that was a way of suddenly realizing, you know, for us, it's easy to say we are so powerless in this world. We encounter, you know, we encounter plastic pollution, we encounter, you know, all kinds of horrible things in this world. And we sometimes don't know what to do with them, like these big problems. Like sometimes I wake up in the night, I'm like, oh my God, the world's going to end. You know, these are really big problems. And for me, whenever I talk to her, there is this point of hope that maybe I'm a bee, maybe I leave that small an impact in the 6 weeks I live, but that's an important thing to do. So this power of the individual, the power of what each of us can do for anything that's big in the world is what I've learned from her. And now she has an all-women bakery. The other thing she would do is every time I would go to Buffalo Bank, one new mortar and pestle that Rolu and Rokali would surface. I'm like, where is this thing come from? She's like, I saw it on the road. So Bangalore has this thing of mortar and pestles are abandoned because nobody uses them anymore, and they don't know, people don't know what to do with them, so they leave it by the street corner. So she'll keep rescuing these, and her house is full of these abandoned mortar and pestles. And, but it's also a metaphor, if we think about it. It's a metaphor for recognizing the struggle of women, the labor of women in the kitchens. So she now has an all-women bakery, and these women make the most excellent ragi cookies, the most excellent podis and sesame laddus. The sesame laddu, which is made in Vishala's bakery, is in the book. Again, these women were so generous when they were sharing these recipes. There was the spirit of generosity, which I was totally humbled by. Like what they were giving, what they were willing to share with the world was just immense. Not just life lessons like recipes and stories, and how much of them they were willing to share. So that bakery is again all disadvantaged women. For them, this is the only space where they can be themselves in a way. It's you know, where they don't have any decision-making opportunities in their own homes. They run it fully independently. Vishala barely does anything there. Like the women run the bakery themselves. It's just amazing. Maybe I'll do one more story and then open up for questions. Can I go to the last slide? Not last. Yeah, stop. Okay. This is Sriyanti. Sriyanti is my goddaughter's grandmother. And many readers have written to me that they have been very moved by Sriyanti's story. On the surface, she's a homemaker. If you ask her, she's like, I haven't done anything much in life. But I think being a homemaker is one of the most important things nobody acknowledges in the world. She lives alone. She lives in Pune. She had this story of why she has named her daughter. Her daughter is called Madhur. Anybody wants to guess? She's named after Madhur Jaffrey. She was married to an Air Force officer, so she moved from Hubli, which is a really hot region, to Kashmir. So she lived in Kashmir for a bit. And she's like, that cold I couldn't bear. And somehow on BBC, we would watch Madhur Jaffrey. And there was a point of great comfort for me, just watching Madhur Jaffrey cook on television so much that she's named her daughter Madhur. She now lives in Pune, but she's a miracle worker with her hands. Even today, she'll be making some yoga mat. She sent me a bag upcycled with saris recently. She's just a miracle worker with her hands. She apparently stitched all her daughter's clothes till her daughter was 10 years old. She lived in Secunderabad for a bit, and apparently she learned baking from the institution here. There's a baking institution here. And she not only just learned, but she would bake wedding cakes, like tiered wedding cakes with icing for like Christian weddings. So she has this whole free spirit to her. And when readers write to me saying, you know, I could identify my mom in that story, I could identify my aunt in that story. In fact, I identify myself in that story too. I identify so many women I know in that story. It's, again, as I said, homemaker is sometimes just a never acknowledged role in this society, I think. Taken for granted totally. Then she turned vegan in her 60s. She's this complete wild free spirit, goes traveling alone. Like every other month, I'm like, where are you, auntie? She's like, I've gone to Narmada, some Narmada tour. So and then I think just before the pandemic, she had gone off to Japan by herself. So it's this complete excitement for life. And she says, cooking is a way for me to access that identity. You know, I'm this free spirit. And I need a space for that expression. How do I express myself? And one of the ways of expressing herself is cooking for herself. So even like one of the recipes she shares is a cauliflower stem recipe. So basically, you know, what we discard, like the leaves and cauliflower, she makes a chutney with that. Once she made me a rasam with the mango stone, like the seed of the mango, which we usually throw away. She had made a rasam with the stone of the mango. And pumpkin peel, she had made dosa once. So I think it's a way of being in the world, a way of complete gratitude to what the earth gives us and how do we justice to what we are getting from the earth. Somebody wrote a review recently, I'm not cribbing, but How to Be a Sustainable Cook was the name of the review. And I'm like, this book is more than that. I mean, of course, these are ways of life. If you see, everybody has shared a recipe which will have some zero waste somewhere. But this is a much more wider landscape we are talking about. We are talking about human-animal conflict. We are talking about permaculture. We are talking about, how do we reduce plastic usage in the world? How do we use every single resource that the earth is giving us? Anyway, so I think the book's trying at least to cover a wide range of issues. My mom's a part of the book too, but I'm not talking about her story. If you want to, you can browse the book later. I think I'll stop at this point and see if you have any questions. If you don't have questions, I can keep talking about my...
Before a question, just because you're talking about the cauliflower, I don't know how many of you know, we in the north, Lucknow part, we make use of the cauliflower florets. We make pickle out of the stem, and we also make the bhurji out of the leaves. So there's actually nothing that we leave out of it excepting one small little circle at the end. So that's how well we use. So now we open it up. Could you pass on the mic? She raised her hand first. No, we are recording it.
Is from my grandmother's sari. There were so many things that were very natural with five morsels in a way that it wasn't for Why Cook. Also because it's a much larger landscape I'm trying to write and trying to put together in a book. And these are, see, when I did interviews, you'll see that these stories are written in like 1,000 words. Each person's story is 1,000 words followed by recipes. I did not go with like a set of questions. What do you like to cook? What's your favorite dish? Why do you cook? When did you start cooking? What's your favorite ingredient? I did not go into these interviews with this questionnaire. These were conversations. And I would record them and listen to them and write down points and whatever, weave the story around what was coming together as a cohesive whole. And in fact, Sriyanti said, nobody has interviewed me in my life before. So it was like a great moment of, and her daughter is like, please share that recording with me. I need to know how my mother sounds when she's being interviewed. Sorry, to come back to your question, as I said, this is a question I have asked of myself. This is a question I have asked of everybody in the book, but not directly. Like when Arundhati Nag says, I didn't cook with coconut, I didn't cook with Saraswat ingredients for a while in my life till I wanted to keep somebody's memory alive. It's a question that's getting answered. It's a question that's already getting answered. When Sriyanti says it's a way of accessing my identity, it's when I try apple, she had an apple pineapple chutney once in her house. And I'm like, where do you get these ideas from? Like, where do you get these crazy ideas from? The first time I ate peanut curd was in her house. And she makes this juice with betel leaves. And it's just, I think that there's a recipe for that too in the book. But these questions were getting answered in a way that was not direct. That was way how their lives were being lived. My book designer didn't like the title. She said it's too dry. Five Morsels is poetic. Why Cook is too abstract, it's too dry. But I'm like, it's a question all of us, I think especially for women, it's a much much more loaded question. It's a question that's so loaded because it's political at a certain level, it's it's identity at a certain level. For instance, why didn't I cook till I was like 32 years old? Because I thought the world was telling me to go, oh, you are good academically, so you should go to business school, you should, wear, pantsuits and aspire for a particular way of life, right? And I went against the grain. Sorry, I lost my thread there a little bit. But I think the question is what I had for myself. And for me, it's been the biggest education in my life is to be in the kitchen.
No question, Archana, but I just wanted to tell you, ever since I read about your book and saw the book, read it, I've been waiting to meet you.
Okay, thank you.
My life revolves around food.
Yeah.
Everything about
what
food
a blessing it is. What a loss it,
yes.
When I look back, what a loss it was for me that I had to wait 32 years of my life to discover this joy.
I didn't wait that long. When I was 14, I was married into a very conservative family where, we didn't allow outsiders to come into the kitchen. And my mother-in-law was extremely contemptuous that I didn't know how to cook at that age. And when I cried and told my mother, how could you do this and send me into that? She said, what's the big deal? You start cooking now, you'll learn in a few. And she was right. I started cooking, and now today everybody in my, I have a big name, yeah. And so I love cooking, love planning menus, love buying stuff, cook and actually cooking and serving. That is, instant gratification.
Yeah, my grandmother she derived extreme joy from just serving.
Yeah, and the same thing happened to me when you're talking about your grandmother. When my grandmother was on her deathbed, the only thing that made her come alive was when I spoke to her about cooking. Used to make that lovely ragi sangati, and she would, glow. And then I decided to write a book for my granddaughter, for my niece, as a wedding gift, family recipes. I did that. And since then, I've been wanting to ask you how you could, make it in a, of course, these are all professional things which you may not would want to share, but that I'll do separately. You look like a generous person. I'm sure you will tell me. You're closer to my daughter's age, but I will take that advice from you.
Sure. I'm happy. I'm around. You can chat with me after the session.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
You've been talking about cooking as joy. Have you interviewed people for whom cooking is a necessity? Something that they have to do, whether they like it or not. I love cooking, but I don't expect every woman to love cooking. And there are some who have to cook. And what about underprivileged people? Do you have, to cook with whatever you have? I think
it's a great question. And it's something that I was very aware while I was writing this book. I was very aware of the fact that maybe this book will be looked at as a book of privilege, that it's privileged women doing things. And it was not something I was blind to. And, I come with a certain privilege too to this whole thing. Privilege was not something that was blind to me. But at the same time, like you look at Molly's story, or look at Vishala's story. Vishala is a total Gandhian. She lives her life a certain way. Molly's parents run the whole Timbuktu collective as a cooperative, which means everybody is an equal stakeholder. Every farmer divides the profits equally. So there was some self-selection in how I went about who I wanted to be a part of this book. And in fact, Molly says in this thing, when they were growing up in Timbuktu, there was no time for elaborate meals. There was no this slow-cooked some curry for like 5 hours. There was no slow cooking. Slow cooking in a sense, you'll probably put it on the katla-poyi and you leave it. You put it on the wood fire and let it cook over a period of time. But there was nothing, and even when she was sharing this, she's like, Bengali dal, simple dal it is. It's not some fancy recipe. And she says, we didn't have time for elaborate meals. This was like quick, eat, go, work. Like we have work to do. And therefore, the lives are very, very reflective of how they cook, the women in the book. I couldn't, the thing is, there's a barrier I couldn't cross. Like, for instance, my house help is a very good cook. And I have had these conversations with her where she says it's sometimes really tiring because I worked in 6 houses and I have to go home and cook. You think it's a joy for me? Of course not. And it is very embedded in the class privilege that, there's a large sector of women or even men who have to do this as a job, who have to do this for livelihood. But, I have, like we have had a family cook for like 35 years. His name is Wali. And I acknowledge him, I praise him in my book. He's my guru at a certain level. Like even now when I go home, I'm always around him trying to learn something in the kitchen. And he has cooked for 35 years of his life. He loves cooking. Even if there is nobody in the house, he'll make off one box of arise and keep. He'll make off one box of muruku and keep. Because it's a big joy for him. So I did not consciously go behind the class question in this book. I have to address it separately somehow. But yes, I will admit that this book comes with a little bit of privilege. And there are enough people who have to do it as job, as labor. But I'm also acknowledging, like for instance, through Vishala's story, when we're talking about this bakery that she has, or, there's this consciousness to the labor that goes into the act of cooking. And I think even if somebody who has no idea of this acknowledges this labor, I think the book's crossing, a step further in this conversation. Yeah, but I haven't fully answered your question, maybe.
One last question, because we just have 3 minutes.
I went through the schedule for the Lit Fest. I saw this particular session and I've been pestering her, we must go for this session. For some reason, the observation is, I was discussing this with a friend whose daughter is at hostel. She's studying somewhere. And she constantly is eating out. She's eating burgers and pizzas and things. And he's trying to tell her, beta, why don't you cook? Why don't you cook your dal and eat? And she says, no, I don't like to cook. So this came back to me and I said, I must go for this session just to know why should somebody be cooking their own food and eating it? Which is what I expected the session to be in this day of Swiggy and Zomato. Okay, so most people are now ordering food from outside. What we want to know is why we should cook at home and what nutritional value that food will have besides other things.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the book. I mean, it's also obvious for those of us who cook why we do it, right? Because it's the most wholesome way to live. It's the most healthiest way to live. When we are consciously cooking for ourselves, we are balancing meals, all of that. And Indian food actually is very balanced. Like when we do our dal, sabji, curd, rice, roti, whatever, like our plate is very wholesome in itself. It's an obvious answer. It gets touched upon in the book in different ways. But I didn't want the book not to be nuanced and just answer it in one straight. It's healthy for you. It's good for you to cook. And those come through the narrative of the stories.
You want? Last bole to last.
Yeah, I want to know why you chose to self-publish and how did you market? If there's no time, we can talk later.
I'll give a one-line answer and then maybe we can catch up later. As I said, I self-published because my grandmother self-published her own book. So I thought I should. Also, I wanted the photographer I wanted to work with, the designer I wanted to work with, the editor. And I was very sure that if I go to a publisher, I may lose all the creative control. I may lose. For me, the team is very important. And the same team worked on Why Cook Too. We've remained friends over the journey of 10 years of making 5 morsels in this without, stabbing each other. So, so the team was very important to me, who I worked with. We had to creatively connect and work on the book. The second question about marketing is the only thing I do is a little bit of social media. As I said, word of mouth has really helped the book garner attention. The recipes really work. I think the proof is in the pudding, right? Like you cook, the recipe is so great, you tell a friend, hey, you should get this book because I made this wankai biryani and it's turned out so well. So I think the proof is in the pudding, the recipes work. And that's the... I do yoga. I was a dancer all my life.
The fact that you are a dancer could be made out because most of the time you were in some pose or the other. So I was observing your body language too. This tapestry of stories and the recipes really seems that we must go in and buy this book. And as Sunita Reddy said, it's such a joy, more in cooking and serving than just consuming it for ourselves. I am sure all of you enjoyed this. It really deserves a good, loud. Wish we had more time to hear more stories and some more mouth-watering, stuff. But we need to get on to the next session. Thank you so much, Archana. Thank you.